Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. The latest from Chantelle Cameron ahead of her fight with Jessica Camara, explaining why she left Frank Warren to sign with Jake Paul after what she describes as a horrendous year. Chantelle Cameron contemplated retirement after watching her career stagnate. The Northampton puncher became the first, and to date only woman, to beat future first ballot Hall of Famer Katie Taylor in May of 2023 with a valiant display at Dublin's 3 Arena. She won the fight as the away fighter in Ireland, of all places. In doing so, she laid claim to the undisputed super lightweight titles and jumped up to the number 2 spot in the women's pound-for-pound rankings. When they rematched 6 months later, Cameron came desperately close to repeating her heroics, only to come up short via a majority decision. A rubber match was expected to follow, but rather than settle the score with Cameron, Taylor opted to rekindle the flame with Amanda Serrano. The decision left Cameron in boxing limbo as she embarked on a frustrating 2024 that included 2 stay busy fights with Elham Mekhaled and Patricia Bergulk.
Mekhaled!
Those 2 fights were fought under the Queensberry Promotions banner. Heading into 2025, Cameron only had 1 fight left on her deal with Frank Warren's Queensberry, and with seemingly no new contract in sight, El Capo considered hanging her gloves prematurely. That was up until Jake Paul's MVP came calling. I think this is the best move I made. Signing for MVP with Jake Paul and Nikisa Badarian, Cameron told Talk Sport. I feel like the doors are going to open up for me again. Obviously, I had the first fight with Katie Taylor, got the win, went back to Ireland, didn't get the win in the rematch. I feel like too much of what Chantelle Cameron does is contingent upon whatever Katie Taylor's doing. She was contemplating retirement instead of maybe moving to welter, fighting Michaela Mayer or Sandy Ryan, Lauren Price, Natasha Jonas. There are other names out there that she shouldn't have been contemplating retirement. The trilogy was due to happen, but it never did happen. And then I had a bit of a frustrating year, but that's in the past now. I've got a new promoter, a new trainer, Stephen Smith, and I feel like I'm in good hands with MVP. Not uncommon when it comes to Chantelle, she's always changing her decorum. It gives you a sense that the fighter's never really satisfied. Used to train with Shane, then it was Jamie Moore, then I think she spent a brief amount of time at Steel City Boxing, and now it's Stephen Smith. MVP are signing all the females, so the fights are going to be there to be made, and there's going to be no avoiding. It's going to be a hell of a lot easier. MVP have really promoted and invested in women's boxing, so as a female boxer, it is the place to be, and it doesn't make sense to be anywhere else, because it is where all the action is and where you are going to get promoted. Queensberry were wholly supportive of Cameron's move to MVP. They even helped facilitate the deal. Queensberry were absolutely amazing. Cameron added when asked how easy it was to get the deal over the line. They didn't stand in the way. Even though she was reported to have 1 fight left on her deal, I just wish I had the opponents to perform for Queensberry, because they were so good to me, but the fights just weren't there. And I'm glad I got 2 wins, but were they fights I really wanted or needed? Not really, but I'm very glad and grateful that I was able to stay active, although it was kind of a year that passed by. Queensberry were that good that they helped me make this deal because they saw what Jake and Nikisa were doing. I was considering my future until I got this over the line, so it was a fantastic thing that I did. Cameron's first assignment under the MVP banner is a clash with Jessica Camara on the July 11th Taylor vs. Serrano trilogy all-female card at MSG, provided that she comes through the contest unscathed. The winner of Taylor and Serrano's super lightweight 4-belt shootout will be ordered to face Cameron as their WBC mandatory challenger. I've said this before, and I'll say it here again. I feel like if Katie wins, we'll see the Cameron trilogy. But if Amanda wins, she might retire after that, or move down. She won't stay at 140, I don't think. At which point, the belts will go vacant and get redistributed, and maybe a Sandy Ryan moves down to 140 to pick up one of those titles. Maybe Chantelle becomes WBC champion. The current number 1 ranked contender in their ranked standings is Mexico's own Carla Zamora. That might be who Chantelle has to fight if she can't get the winner of Taylor vs. Serrano 3 and the titles go vacant.
And maybe in a scenario like that, you could see a unification between Chantelle and Sandy. It just sounds extreme that because Chantelle couldn't get the trilogy with Katie right away, she was contemplating retirement when there are other names out there, plenty of other names out there. There's Michaela, Natasha, Lauren, Sandy.
They're right up there at welterweight. Seems strange to me that Chantelle didn't consider just moving up in weight for the big fights.
Future fights like a potential Caroline Dubois fight when she ends up moving up, because you know she's going to. Beatrice Ferreira.
I said it then, when she made the move from Matchroom over to Queensbury, that I don't know why she's going over there, because Queensbury doesn't have the bodies. They don't have the opponents for her, and it almost looked like she was doing it out of spite. She talks about Queensbury fondly, and I'm sure that they treated her well, but the reality of it is, the biggest opportunities Chantelle's ever had in her career all came under the Matchroom banner. Every single title she ever won, every big fight that she ever had.
When she went over to Queensbury, even though they kept her active for at least 2 fights, it was almost like she fell out of the spotlight. They weren't pushing her as hard as Matchroom had been pushing her up until that point.
Now, Chantelle can have her feelings on it from her perspective, but from the fan perspective, I saw and heard more about Chantelle Cameron from Matchroom than I ever saw from Queensbury. So now she's with MVP, and hopefully they can satisfy Chantelle to get her whatever it is she wants out of what remains of her career. But like I said, it always felt like she's too focused on Katie Taylor, and that fight in particular, that there are other names out there, and with MVP in her corner, they can make some of those fights happen too, and those fights would be good fights too.
But what I'm saying is, he would not stand a chance with David. David's the Mexican monster. He's young. He's coming strong. It's his time now. I'll tell you right now, like I told everybody, don't forget about that fight with David Benavidez and Canelo Alvarez. If I was Canelo's trainer, I would beg him. I would advise him, don't fight this fucking monster. Don't fight David. You can end up in the hospital. You know, at the end of the day, that's what I'm saying. I'm not disrespecting him. Right. Dude, he's a young fucking monster. Hungry. You see what he did right now? Fresh people, you know? Can he? No disrespect to Canelo. He already did what he did. But it comes a time where you gotta pass the torch to somebody else. Yeah. The guy that's right now at that weight is the Mexican monster, David Benavidez.
Yeah. Regeneration. Yep.
Came across this video just the other day, reposted by Two-Tone the Superstar, as Jose Benavidez is still using the name of Canelo Alvarez as a talking point to sell his fighter, to sell his son. I've long maintained that the biggest selling point for a David Benavidez fight is mentioning Canelo. Without that, it's just not as exciting.
Remember that he was right there in that same super middleweight division for years before Canelo even came into it, before he went on his undisputed run, fighting the exact same way.
And in those days, the super middleweight division was ripe for the taking. It was an open book, with 4 alphabet titles split between 4 champions, none of which David Benavidez unified with. But alas, things don't get interesting until Canelo comes into it. Then all of a sudden, David's interesting. David's a monster. David's gonna put Canelo in the hospital.
I still think Canelo beats him.
Oh, I know that Canelo Alvarez's last fight was hardly a barn burner, having to chase Williams' skull around the ring for 36 minutes, but do remember that David is not the kind of fighter you have to chase.
That you have to find. David Benavidez would come forward on Canelo Alvarez, try to bear down on him, in effect, doing half the work for Canelo. What people tend to forget is that Canelo Alvarez doesn't have a super middleweight's frame, so a lot of effort has to go into just getting within proximity of his opponents. With David, he wouldn't have that problem.
And I don't think for a second that David Benavidez is better mid-range to inside than Canelo Alvarez. No, at that proximity, the smaller fighter actually has the advantage with the shorter arms.
The one thing I can give David over Canelo is activity. He is a busier fighter within a round. With Canelo, it's really only 1 or 2 hard shots at a time, whereas with David, he can throw 3, 4, 5 punch combinations as soon as he gets within proximity of his opponent. But the caveat is, every time he opens up, he risks being countered. And we've seen it on multiple occasions. He can be caught in between the punches. He has been caught.
He's been dropped 2 more times than Canelo Alvarez ever has, and that's not because of how great his defense is.
So you can give David Benavidez activity over Canelo Alvarez, but not defense. And not power, I think. No, I think Canelo actually cracks a bit harder than David. With David, a lot of those flurries are arm punches. Jose talks about David putting Canelo in the hospital.
Please.
The beating that Canelo put on Caleb was more life-altering than anything he experienced with David.
Talk about Vosdick. Vosdick was beaten within an inch of his life by Artur Beterbiev so that years later he could go the distance with David. He took David's power for 36 minutes, and at the end of it, he was fine. So was David Morrell.
He's not killing these guys.
See, a lot of people say that it's been a long time since Canelo knocked anybody out, but the same applies to David. When is the last time he knocked somebody out?
And he's younger, a lot younger than Canelo, and a lot bigger, so what's his excuse?
Canelo is a veteran of over 60 fights spread across 4 or 5 weight classes in his mid-30s, competing in the super middleweight division, not having a super middleweight's frame. That's his excuse.
That's why he doesn't knock people out as much as he used to, but what's David's? David stands in at, 6'2", walks around 200 and change, supposed to be in his prime, so why isn't he knocking people out?
It's unfortunate that Canelo Alvarez didn't fight him. I thought that he would, and I still think he would beat David, because David is just a basic plotter, a basic fighter.
Simple.
There's no way Canelo would face David Benavidez. To be honest, he would. I would say that he would send him to a hospital. The body's not the same no more. David's super strong, young, and I believe that fight will never happen.
Fans prefer to see the fight against David, but could you possibly see maybe even before or after getting to the fight with Crawford?
No, I don't think. That's very sad for him to leave boxing that way. He did a lot for boxing, but he's not recognizable like a true champion because he did not face David, and that ghost is always going to be there. The shadow is always going to follow him around because he didn't fight David. But at the end of the day, I think Canelo, could make exhibition fights. He don't need the belts. He's already recognized. A lot of people would watch him fight and still make big fights. He can fight against the YouTuber, what's his name? Jake Paul. That could be another great fight. At the end of the day, it's entertainment, so he still, can make exhibition fights.
Canelo Alvarez had the option of fighting in a circus fight, fighting in an exhibition with the likes of Jake Paul. But if he had elected to do that, the media would have tore him a new one, the boxing fans. The outrage would have been everywhere. Now, coincidentally, they're not as outraged when they hear the exact same thing pertaining to Gervonta Davis, who has an itemized grocery list of names that he could fight and he should fight, just like Canelo. But they don't get as mad.
You say that Canelo should have fought David Benavidez. I say Gervonta should have fought Shakur Stevenson. He should have fought Devin Haney. He should have fought Teofimo.
Gervonta is not a veteran of over 60 fights in his mid-30s like Canelo, having competed in 4 or 5 separate weight classes. So what's his excuse for entertaining a social media influencer? Why is there no outrage? It has been confirmed that if Gervonta Davis would have beat Lamont, he was going to fight Jake after that. Now, if he beats him in August, what do you think he's going to do? And if he does it, is the media going to treat him the way they were about to treat Canelo?
This is why I always give Canelo consideration, because I know that the media isn't. He can't get a fair shake with them.
Another example, just the other day I brought up how I don't think that Canelo gets enough credit for knocking out Sergey Kovalev, who was WBO light heavyweight champion at the time. Now, what people like to say is that Sergey was old, but here's reality.
Sergey was younger than the Vosdick that David Benavidez fought. Sergey was a champion. Vosdick wasn't. While you're oohing and eyeing that David fought Vosdick to a decision, Canelo knocked Kovalev out.
Now, that's the same Sergey Kovalev that knocked out a then unbeaten Anthony Yarde. The same Anthony Yarde that David Benavidez is trying to fight now, Sergey knocked him out.
And that was years ago. While you tell me that Sergey was old, then what the hell was Vosdick, geriatric?
When Canelo Alvarez beat Callum Smith in one-sided fashion, all his critics could say was that Callum was a Eurobum. Well, that's the same Eurobum that David Benavidez is chasing around now.
Is it a big fight all of a sudden when David fights that same Callum Smith? Is he all of a sudden a credible opponent? Because you didn't give Canelo no credit for fighting that guy, but you'll readily give it to David. And this is the kind of hypocrisy I'm always talking about.
You guys are so desperate to make David out to be something that he's not that you're ignoring who Canelo Alvarez is.
What he's done, who he's fought, because of some flavor of the month.
Jose Benavidez says that not fighting David Benavidez is a stain that's going to follow Canelo around the rest of his career. A ghost that's going to haunt him. When I think that
Canelo not fighting David in the years to come will only stay as relevant as David stays relevant. That if this guy goes on and he don't have much of a legacy, people aren't going to remember him anyway.
David Benavidez is to Canelo's legacy what Keith Thurman was to Floyd Mayweather's legacy. Floyd is a first ballot Hall of Famer.
What is Keith Thurman? Do people even talk about this guy anymore?
Now, Keith is the perfect example because Keith didn't go on to have much of a boxing career. It's not that big a stain. It's not that big an asterisk on Floyd's resume because look at all the guys that he did fight. Better guys than Keith Thurman.
The Keith Thurman that lost to an aged, past prime Manny Pacquiao? Same Manny Pacquiao that Floyd beat.
I think about that, and then I think about David, and I think about Callum. If you actually are lucky enough to get him in a ring, you better not lose. Because there's definitely a parallel there. That David is to Canelo what Keith Thurman was to Floyd. And that would close the circuit. That would facilitate it.
Jose Benavidez and Team Benavidez are still bringing up Canelo Alvarez because if they don't have a heck of a lot to talk about. Even the potential fights that they can have, like Callum, if they're lucky, or Anthony Yard, if they're lucky. Those are still not big fights.
Zerto.
Those are good fights. I am a boxing fan after all, and I view those fighters as credible opponents for David if he can fight them and if he can beat them. But the marquee value of those shows,
they're not big fights. And the only way to get David any attention, it's not really talking about those guys and fighting those guys. It's talking about Canelo, which is why they're still doing it. He's at 168 and you're now at 175. Potentially headed to cruiser, and you're still talking about Canelo.
they're desperate.
I think that they can feel the walls closing in. Campaigning in the light heavyweight division, there's more peril and more danger than what he faced at 168, where he could play the big fish in a small pond. You're so much bigger than all these other guys, you can just outsize them. But at light heavyweight, you're not so big, you don't hit that hard, and it'll be more of that at cruiser.
They're desperate.
For less money, because these are not divisions where the PBC has an abundance of options for David or where the American boxing scene has a whole lot of prize stallions. These are international divisions.
International law.
It's a bit harder to play the big man on campus on the world stage when all you've got to show for it is an email title that isn't even worth very much.
The only guy who talks about Canelo more than them is Oscar.
It's giving single white female vibes.
It's giving.
It's giving nervousness. It's giving apprehension, frustration. It's giving. It's giving update your material because you and Canelo is not a thing anymore.